We'll go ahead and get started with our introductions. I'm Alex Inman. I'm president of Educational Collaborators. We're an edtech, we're an education consulting and professional development company, but most of our work does center around technology initiatives associated at schools, or helping them with their existing, maybe non-technology related initiative, but helping them use technology to catalyze and expand the initiative that they're working on. I spent 20 years in independent schools. Started the first one-to-one program at a small independent school in Wisconsin. Actually, I worked with, I saw, they didn't join, but they've registered, the folks from St. Johnsbury Academy. I worked with Brad Ashley at that school, and he is now the director of St. Johnsbury in Jeju, South Korea. And I worked at a variety of independent schools, most recently at Sidwell Friends School in Washington, D.C., but now I'm full-time living in Colorado working with Educational Collaborators. Shandor.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shandor Simon. I'm Director of Technology over at Lenovo School of Chicago. I've been there about 20 years now. And prior to that, I was at the University of Chicago and worked at the lab school there for about 5 years. I've sort of been passionate about cybersecurity that entire time. Ironically, I think I mitigated my first cyber attack while still a student back in '93 on the internet. So, back then people were doing it for fun as opposed to for money, like seems to be happening now. I'm also on the advisory board for a startup called SpottyWorks that makes training on how to protect critical infrastructure like power plants. There's a little learning kit for that. And some schools are using that. And I also helped author the Atlas cybersecurity recommendations that we'll see a little later in this. And I do work with Alex for Educational Collaborators as well.
Yeah, I suppose I should mention that Educational Collaborators is a little bit different than other consulting groups in that we've got about 130 consultants in our organization, but 85% of them by design are full-time educators. So they're folks like Shandor, folks that are associate heads, librarians, classroom teachers, tech directors at various schools, and we work in collaborative groups. Mostly online, doing work in evenings and weekends to make sure that we can provide schools very relevant support. And so by having folks like Shandor be part of our group, we sort of jokingly but semi-seriously say that our people are really doing 40 hours of R&D to improve their craft every single day, or every week, I guess. And so that's us. So we're going to talk about the role that school leadership should and needs to play in cybersecurity, that it's not just an IT thing, which I think is, it's a concern that I've seen both as a school CFO or CIO, as well as a consultant. Too often, there are school leaders who say, I know that cybersecurity is a problem. I know that it's a concern. My board is telling me that this is a concern. So my solution is to tell the tech guy, hey, can you take care of that? And then whatever they do, when they come back and they say, yeah, I took care of it, then they just sort of say check. And that's not cybersecurity, or at least that's not securing the school. And it goes beyond looking at simply the infrastructure. It's certainly an important piece of it, but there's a lot more to look at, and we're going to talk about some of those pieces and the roles that we need to play in that, and help school leaders start to think about cybersecurity really as an issue of risk management rather than something that is technical and outside of them. So as we go through this, we're going to talk about, we've kind of taken it's fall, so we took the football theme to this. So we'll be taking a look at cybersecurity being a team sport and a group problem. We'll look at focusing on first downs and finding what are the small things that you can do right away to start building that culture of cybersecurity in your school, and then start to look at it from a broader strategic standpoint, and we'll help you build your playbook and build the strategy to build your playbook. And then we've got a special announcement at the end. So Tim, I know you got to leave, but you can come back and check that out on the recording. Okay, let me hand it off to Shandor.
Okay, so before we dive into this, I just want to check in, and we're making some assumptions here that the biggest one is that you understand that cybersecurity is a risk for your school. I don't think you would have shown up for this webinar if you didn't think that. But if you look in the most recent NAS trend book on the edtech section, it talks about cybersecurity, the NAS legal advisory that got sent to head of schools last December also dives into this. And I have a little quote from that here, but fundamentally, cybersecurity has risk around reputation, finance, and legal exposure. And I think that maybe the reputational one is even larger than in other industries for independent schools, because we rely so much on our reputation to attract students and donations and to function. So the assumptions are that we understand that all of our schools are at risk and that we must do something about it. And I would hope that the assumption is also that you must do something about this. Like I said, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here. So diving in dealing with risk outside of the cybersecurity context within it, doing tabletop exercises is often a really effective way of understanding your preparedness and sort of how to react and how to think of it. So we have a little exercise here that we'll run through as a scenario. While I'm doing it, think of what would happen if this happened at your school. And then we'll just use it to unpack cybersecurity risks in schools and leadership's role in dealing with that. So to start out with our example here, this is slightly modified, but it actually happened at an independent school. It's completely anonymized in this context for obvious reasons. So the story is that an email went out to prospective waitlist parents, congratulating them on being admitted to the school and providing them with a link to make a donation. The problem was that it was a scam, and that link took them to a fraudulent website that, while it did collect the deposit, it didn't go to the school, and it went to the folks stealing money from the school. So, think for a moment, if this happened at your school, what kind of impact would it have? So, Alex, if you could go to the next slide. Thanks. So first, my question for you is, whose problem is this? Who should be the one responding? Is it the admissions team because this message allegedly came from them and they own that process of admitting families? Perhaps it's the business office because it involves money and the school being ripped off. Perhaps it's a communications problem because you're going to have some very unhappy people with your school. Is it the IT department's problem? I mean, clearly this involved technology, so it's their problem. Or is it whoever interfaces with law enforcement at your school? Or is it going to be one of these catch-all things that any problem sufficiently complicated becomes a problem for the head or CFO? And you can see arguments for all of these people. And that's sort of my point, that hopefully you don't see the scenario and immediately say, let's call the IT director, he's going to fix all of this. He has all the tools, all the information, can do everything to solve this, because clearly this is purely a technical problem. Well, I would argue it's not. Your tech director can help you, but all of these people end up likely being involved. So let's, I don't want to bring up an example without diving into how this potentially could happen at a school. That's not really the focus of our presentation today, but I think it's useful to get into that. So what happened was that an admissions staff member at this school received an email, a phishing attack, where they were tricked into divulging their password for their email. The hacker then was able to access their email account. And, you know, if you use Microsoft or Google's cloud email things, there's places to store files there and they're real convenient. Or you have files in your email. But in this case, it likely was, you know, a Google Sheet document tied into that same email account, where they found all these prospective waitlist families and all of their email addresses. And since they had control of this email account, they could actually send out a legitimate email from a school email account from someone in the admissions team congratulating these families on admission to the school and collecting the deposit. So we can see here that, like, there's not much technical mitigation that, you know, we can do from the recipient side of these messages, because they're entirely legitimate messages. So, and they're actually coming from the school. So it's a little tricky. It's not just a question for them of spotting a phishing message. So let's, you know, proceed and talk to, like, how we could have prevented this and what roles, you know, could have been part of that process. So you'll see here there's reference to personnel procedure under training, configuration, and technical. These are, you know, I'm foreshadowing something we'll show you a little bit later around the Atlas recommendations and how these things line up to them. But for now, like, the really obvious thing is, if we had done cybersecurity awareness and made every employee go through it, we likely could have prevented the admissions team member from clicking on the link and having their account compromised. You know, this is something that, you know, IT has a large role in implementing, but it's really a school policy decision, and you have to somehow enforce it. And if that's coming from the head's office or from HR or from the CFO or someone needs to tell everyone they have to do this. I think there's some irony that the people who most need this training are the ones least likely to take it when it's a voluntary thing. At least that's been my experience. There seems to be high correlation between people who haven't done training and get their accounts compromised. And I'd like to think that that is, you know, in my experience, all about how wonderful the training I found was. But I kind of think that there's another correlation going on here, that the people most at risk are the ones paying the least attention. The other mitigation is this two-factor authentication. For those of you who aren't familiar with that term, if you log into your bank account and have to get a code on your cell phone and type it in, that code is a second factor beyond just your password. So if the school had enabled two-factor authentication, which I think is pretty much table stakes at this point for most schools on what they should be doing around cybersecurity, just having the employee's password compromised wouldn't have been enough to allow them to gain access. Okay.
Let me just ask right now, of the schools that are on this call here, how many of you have enabled two-factor authentication for the email accounts of anyone at your school?
We have not, and on that note, I gotta go.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. I'll check out the rest of this when it gets posted. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is Jim. We have not either.
Okay.
This is Eric from New Hampton, and we have two-factor authentication enabled for all of our employees, and we use Office 365 and Azure Active Directory, so all that works together pretty well. And we're considering how to roll it out to our students also, because they're just as easily tricked by emails as adults can be. I completely agree with your correlation where people who are least likely to take the training are the biggest issues, because we also use KnowBe4 for the training. We do phishing training, and the employees that take the longest to do it are the ones with the highest fish prone percentage. We have some users over 50% fish prone, which is pretty embarrassing for them.
And for others on the call, KnowBe4 is a solution that does phishing training and phishing testing, where they send out fake phishing messages and report back to your community on how many people sort of took the bait, right? So it's a great tool that a lot of schools use to help prepare your community for phishing. Jonathan, do you guys have two-factor authentication? You're on mute if you're responding.
Yep, talking on mute's not good. Yeah, so I'm with Eric. So it's same school we do.
Oh, right. Okay.
And as somebody, I'm not in the IT office, but our IT department does a really good job of getting in front of all employees several times a year talking about it. It's sometimes an update at the board level as well. So Eric has done a good job of keeping everybody focused on it, and I think has pretty good institutional support.
Great. All right, Shandor.
All right, so why don't we move on? So I think ultimately the important thing to take away from our case study here was that the response and the mitigation are both things that go beyond just IT, and the school as a whole needs to embrace them. Different offices have to come together to roll something out like that know-before product and get people to actually use it and comply with going through that training. Two-factor authentication is something that at first sometimes people worry is too annoying to deal with, you know, and a barrier. Although I think today most people are using it enough in their personal life because of online banking that the barrier has lowered. But it's basically a team sport, using our metaphor of football here, and everyone has a role in it. And I think that's actually great news for us, because fundamentally I've observed independent schools are really good at working collaboratively on things and coming together to solve common problems. So cybersecurity is a common problem. It isn't one that can be solved because it keeps changing and it's ongoing. So it's something we have to keep working on. But it's really about having a team come together. So on the next slide here, I have a chart that is part of actually the EC Cybersecurity, the full offering. And my school went through it, and I've also done it for other folks. But really the first step there is pulling a team together if you don't already have one around cybersecurity. And we look for people to be on the team from a couple of different hats that they wear. Some people, especially in smaller schools, can wear multiple hats. But we need people looking at cybersecurity from each of these areas. So you need someone on the school leadership team, need not be the head of school necessarily. Obviously, if you have their support in that group, that makes it easier, but someone, you know, who can look at it from that top-down perspective and can figure out how to do something that, you know, everyone at the school is forced as a condition of employment to do, and, you know, that online training or using two-factor authentication. You also, so at my school, I think it was our assistant head of school that was part of this process, and I'm also on the senior leadership team at my school, so I wore that as one of my hats. We also had our HR director in the room, and she's also on the senior leadership team. So we had, my team was somewhat large. Yours doesn't need to be, but needs, you know, multiple people from different areas. In terms of risk management, however you're managing that risk, there are people at your school that, you know, are involved with buying insurance and looking at risk generally. Often the sort of CFO, finance type people would fall under that, but you know, might be someone else in your school. But there's cybersecurity insurance, and just sort of that mindset of how to manage risk is important in this process, because it's all about prioritization of what you're going to work on and figuring out the cost benefit of that. The group of users that I think is probably the most overlooked is this sort of privileged data users. And they're the people that are dealing with your most sensitive data. And they understand typically why protecting that data is so important, but they also understand, you know, that, you know, like they still have a job to do with that data, and you can't lock it up so much that it's unusable. And they can catch things that no one else in the institution is aware of, maybe in how you're handling credit cards or how you share credentials with alumni for the alumni website that has the alumni directory in it. And they can catch things. Of course, there's still a role for a tech team in there because a lot of the solutions are tech-based and the threat is, definitely in the tech camp. But I think many schools make the mistake of just asking the tech director to figure this out, not including these other roles. And then there's a very limited amount of things that the tech team can do. I'll share my experience. I started off basically doing that. I saw the risk at my school. I'm like, hey, this is a tech problem. I can solve it. And there are some things that I could just go clickety click and enable on firewalls or disk encryption or whatever that I didn't need to ask permission or get a lot of buy-in or anything. But that did very little to move the needle of where our risk was. And it wasn't until we engaged a broader team. And my school now has a board level risk management task force, and they're involved in this too. So lots of people coming together to sort of figure this out and work together. Alex, did you have anything to share on this point?
No, I'll talk a little bit about this later on when we talk about the building your roadmap.
Awesome.
Give you a chance to sip a little tea.
Sorry, everyone, if you joined late. I'm fighting a cold, so I'm needing to take some breaks.
Shandor, just a pacing issue. We need to pick up our pace just a little bit.
Sure. So I mentioned earlier, there's this Association of Tech Leaders in Independent Schools. Hopefully you know about them. Relatively new organization, kind of like NBOA for techie folks. That's the quick version of it. So they came together, brought people from all over the place in the cybersecurity industry, in the independent school world, in the business world, to build recommendations that are tailored for independent schools. Overall, there are 48 recommendations, which definitely feels overwhelming. I want to explain to you, though, how they're laid out. There are 3 columns here of different types of policies. There's the configuration technical, which are easier, for the IT folks to do. There's the personnel procedures, which are more institutional, and likewise general policies at the school that are more institutional. So we can look at these and see the multi-factor authentication is an example of a technical one, doing background checks on hiring is a personnel one, and cybersecurity insurance is a general policy. Now, not all schools are the same. We're all different sizes and shapes and have different people attending them. So there are actually 4 levels of these recommendations, and the idea is smaller schools do fewer of those levels maybe, or ones that have more sophisticated risk profiles, like because of their affiliation, religious affiliations, or the parents that attend the school need to do more of these levels. So that's just a quick introduction to the Atlas recommendations here.
Before we go on, I have a question. How much of the recommendations were used or were written from the CIS 20?
My general, I have to look at them, but I think there's a recommendation that actually points to that on them. But they looked at a number of different standards out there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I know they looked at CIS and NIST, and I know they also looked at like some school-related ones like COSIN, and so so you'll see a lot of similarities across these and those other solutions or those other recommendation bases, Eric. But I think one of the other sort of focuses of the Atlas group was to make them a little more accessible and attainable by non-tech people, which I think is a significant contribution to the cybersecurity world. Are you ready for the next slide?
Yep. So this is the result of an EC assessment based off of those standards. We've broken out a few of those standards into a few more things, so there are a few more recommendations. But what I want to show you here is, like, if you go through this self-assessment, answer the questions to where you are, you'd end up with a report like this. And green is good. That means you have that thing covered. Yellow means it's in progress, and red means you have some work to do there. And generally speaking, most people who go through this see a lot of red and yellow in it. And, you know, I haven't seen anyone do this and just have green everywhere and like, hey, we got this. We don't have to worry about that. So Alex will explain sort of like when you get this intimidating document, where you go from here. But I want to introduce, using our football metaphor, this concept of why we think you need to focus on first downs. I don't, you know, like if you're trying to have a winning record as a team, focusing on that may not really be all that useful, and it's very complicated and hard. If we go to the other extreme of just focusing on getting the next first down, that will eventually lead us to win a game, and winning games will lead us to win seasons, and winning seasons will give us that winning record. So you see something like that last slide and you're just overwhelmed with like this laundry list of everything you need to do. Instead, you need to identify the things on there that are the most impactful that you can move forward on now. So I have grabbed some recent schools, independent schools, self studies on cybersecurity using that model that you just saw, and pulled out some interesting things so we can just talk briefly about what these sort of next first downs might be. So one of the things here was looking at, do you have whole disk encryption for all employee laptops? What this means is if a laptop is stolen, is the data encrypted so that no one else can access it? So you don't necessarily have to worry about reporting a data breach or the loss of data on it. And 0 in this context means you don't have anything, and 2 and 4 was those yellow scores, and 6 is green. And as we can see, most schools that responded didn't have anything. And this is really concerning. Cybersecurity coverage is actually a little more interesting. We see schools either feel they have this covered or not at all, and there's not much in the middle. So continuing on here, we have two-factor authentication that we talked about. This is broken out based off of who you're using multi-factor authentication with. First steps is just making sure that people who have access to the most secure data have it. And you know, we see work to be done in this area as well. So, you know, these 3 things are some easy examples of things that maybe when you look at that report might be the most impactful to move us forward as a school.
And it sounds like Eric is somewhere in a level 2 or level 3 in there, which is great, because we see a lot of folks that are showing up as zeros and anything beyond level 1.
So Alex, how do we build our playbook to move forward?
What's that?
I was saying, how do we move our playbook to move forward?
Yeah, so the cybersecurity recommendations that Chandra showed you, and we'll look a little bit more at that again, they'll identify for you some of the areas of risks that you need to do. But now what do you do about this? How do you get your arms around sort of building a strategy to start to address some of these things? And I think some of this is even, how do you choose some of those first downs that you're going to go after in the beginning? And the first, as Chandra mentioned at the beginning, is to build your cybersecurity task force. And it needs to have that cross-section of senior leadership privileged data users, IT members, and risk managers. And what we have found when we do a cybersecurity assessment with the school, the first thing that we do is we get that group together, and that's anywhere from like 3 to like 7 people, or in Shandor's case, like 22. But in most cases, we like to keep that group kind of small so that you can have some meaningful discussions. But we get that group together, and first thing, before we even have them self-assess where they are, is we walk them through those Atlas Cybersecurity best practices. And the very exercise of being in the room with that group of people and discussing what those are is a very eye-opening experience for most of the schools that we work with, in terms of recognizing, oh yeah, this is something that's we're gonna have to involve a lot more people in this than we realized. And that's okay. In fact, it's fantastic. That's what we want you to recognize and understand, that this really is a broad team effort. And as Shandor said at the beginning as well, this is also a good thing, because if there's one thing that independent schools do particularly well, it's get in teams to work together. And so it is something that realization is the first thing that we want schools to recognize. Now, once they get that, where are you? And so what we do is we have taken those Atlas Cybersecurity best practices, we license them from the organization, and then we put them into an online self-assessment where you can look at each of those things, and then there's sort of scales as to how much implementation you can have on that. And we then score your assessment based off of how well you're doing within the spectrum of each of those recommendations. And then we'll export that into a dashboard that then provides you an assessment that tells you what is your greatest risk and what are some of the lowest hanging fruits. But where do you fall across that spectrum? And then once you have sort of seen this is where we are, this is what we need to do, how do we build that into a risk management strategy? In the same way that we're dealing with other risk management. How are schools doing tabletop exercises on admission risk? How are we doing it on financial risk? How are we doing it on emergency preparedness risk associated with fires, tornadoes, earthquakes, etc.? So when we do our full-scale assessment, what we do is we take that data and then we analyze it. Our cybersecurity experts take a look at that and say, what are your critical, this is just an example from a school, but what are the critical recommendations and what are the high impacts? So the criticals are where are the areas where you are opening yourself up to the greatest risk, and then what are the areas that you can have the highest impact on by focusing on first. You may have the skill set in-house to do that by looking at those cybersecurity recommendations, and if you do, that's awesome, and you should leverage that skill set. Maybe that's with your IT staff, maybe it's one of your parents or a community member that you have to help you with that. That's something that EC brings to the table when we do that for you. And of course, we bring it from a school perspective, school CIO perspective. But but the point that I want to sort of make in this slide is that think about your recommendations in terms of impact and severity, and and criticality and severity, as well as impact and sort of that low-hanging fruit. How can you really move the needle quickly? So we derive those from that recommendation, and this is just sort of an export of the dashboard that we create. And what we're looking at is there's a scale score for each of these questions, and sometimes that scale score is 0 to 3. You'll see in the case of like business continuity, we've got a 0 to 9 scale score on that. So we've looked at sort of the ranges associated with that to help you sort of recognize where you are. And we've done this for a couple different reasons. We've played with that scale score for a couple different reasons. One is to sort of give you greater accuracy or greater fidelity on where you are on that. But the other part too is if we just narrow it to the sort of an on-off switch, which I think is what a lot of schools do when they look at these recommendations, I think it undervalues the work that a lot of schools are doing on some of these things. And we want to make sure that as these dashboards are seen by your senior administration and by your board, that it's clear that you've made some progress on this. The other reason why some progress is important is as you get this dashboard and you start to build your roadmap, which we'll get into again in a minute, when you do an assessment, when you do your due diligence to say, where do we have cyber risk? If you do nothing about that, you're actually increasing your liability. If you no longer have the protection against a lawsuit to say, I had no idea. Once you do something like this, you now are aware of the risks associated to your school. You are now obliged to do something about it. The upside is, even if you have not addressed an area where your school has been caught on a vulnerability, but you have the defense to say we were aware of that vulnerability and we have started to make choices about where we are going to make progress, you are providing yourself a certain degree of protection that you would not have had you not done this. So it's important to recognize where you are and start making some progress on mitigation. So when we look at that, we try to cultivate and cull through those reds and start to find what are the reds, what are the highest impacts and what are the lowest hanging fruits that you want to work on. So in this case with this school, we've said that, and this comes up a lot, is multi-factor authentication for email for school leaders and privileged data users. And we discussed sort of why this is necessary. It's critical impact. The school indicated that they haven't done anything at all. 80% of cyber attacks come through email. And in this particular case, the school was known that key administrators had actually shared their passwords in the past. So we know that this is a significant risk for this school. So building your plan can be as simple as we're just using SMART goals when we do this. So a lot of this can be replicated yourself. And so we're just sort of sharing the secret sauce of how we address this. But what we say is, what are the whats? What are the things that you need to do associated with that plan? Who needs to be responsible? What are the key milestones and tasks associated with that? And then are you tracking your progress so that you can show that both not only for your own progress, but also for your own defense should you be breached and have an incident that you need to deal with. So let me go back to this just a minute before we get into some of the questions. So it's important to sort of take your, I rushed because of time, but I'll wrap this. I just want to cover this. I've got one more minute before I want to get to questions. So multi-factor authentication, there's more to it than each of those things. And so this is where you might need your tech team to sort of say, okay, well, if we're going to implement this, what are the steps? What do we need to do? And this is a great place where you need to have the tech person say, well, these people need to do that. But you know what, I'm having problems because the admission director really doesn't think that this is important to him or her. Well, I need the school leader or the head of school to not only do this and model this behavior, but also reinforce this to make sure that other senior leaders are getting this done as well. Start thinking about each of these tasks from a holistic, systematic approach and get all those things down there. If all of the who's end up being the IT department, you're doing it wrong. You really need to make sure that there is a breadth in terms of broader risk management and systematic implementation in your school. And if you're doing that and you're doing it correctly, it is going to involve a broader number of people. So that's sort of a key when you're looking at your plan as to whether or not you're taking a holistic approach. Is this all really falling on just one or two departments? And if so, think more broadly about it. I kind of rushed through that a little bit because I wanted to add some questions and I want to share a little announcement at the end, but let me stop for a minute and ask if you have questions. And I just have to point out that I'm picking on the Vikings for that really confused look, and that's because Shandor and I are both NFC North teams, and he's a Bears fan, I'm a Packers fan, and we think that if anybody's going to be confused, it should be the Minnesota Vikings. Questions?
Where is that tool available that you were talking about?
The online tool is an EC tool. It's a proprietary tool that we have. I'll have a little announcement for you on that. But the tool that we have is based off of the Atlas Cybersecurity recommendations, which are publicly available on the Atlas website, which is theatlas.org. And Atlas is ATLIS, theatlas.org. And you can find those recommendations publicly available there. You don't have to be a member in order to access those. But that level of refinement and scale in there, Eric, that's actually a piece that EC built on there, and we do that as a service for schools. It's unfortunately not something that's really available.
I understand. Thank you.
Will this PowerPoint be available for distribution after this meeting?
It will be. Eliza's recording this, and she'll make that available. Also, I'll send her the slide deck itself so that you guys have access to that.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. So I do want to point out, and this kind of goes back to what Eric was asking about as well. So October is Cyber Awareness Month. And so one of the things that we're doing, and I'm not sure of the sizes of your schools, but we are focusing particularly on small schools. And so you can, if you look at our website and go to educollaborators.com/cybersecurity, you can see information about our full cybersecurity assessment. But particularly for small schools, and during the month we've defined that as schools under 500. If your school is under 500, during October, actually, if you just sign up during October, if we need to, we can schedule it for November. But the offer that we're making through, actually, ISANNE gets it even longer to coordinate with a technology directors meeting that they have at the end of the month. So through November 4th, if you sign up, small schools can get access to our cybersecurity assessment and the dashboard. We won't do the full roadmap for you, but for $1,000, we'll give you access to the cybersecurity assessment and then the dashboard that comes after it, which is those two pieces, the piece that I showed you that has the reds and the yellows and the greens, that shows you where your specific areas are. So you do get access to that granularity. So Eric, if your school is over that and you're really interested in that, give me a call. But if you're under 500, then this is available for a low price for Cybersecurity Month.
And this is a self-administered tool?
It is. And
right.
we work with you to build that team, and then we ask you to take that assessment as a team, not as an individual. We find that schools make far more progress if they go through that assessment piece as a team.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. We're close to the end of our time. Are there any other questions before we wrap up this this webinar?
I don't have any. I'd just like to thank you both for putting the time into this, and I'm really interested in this tool that you were just talking about also. Thank
you. Thanks for having us too. Eliza, thanks so much for putting this together on such short notice. We were glad to be able to do this, especially during
I'm just thrilled that you were able to kind of share your expertise in a few, immediate takeaways that I actually was texting with Teta about that we need to think about at ISANNE. There's just a lot of very useful, helpful, immediate things to do as well as long-term planning. And just to put this in context, I was really excited when Alex reached out. I just went to the ISANNE conference, which is the association membership for EDs around the United States and Canada to get together. And this cybersecurity was probably the #1 topic of conversation that different EDs were interested in making sure that their membership was educated about, as it's just become such a big issue in terms of helping support safe school cultures. So thank you for sharing. Thank you, Shandor, especially with your cold there.
Happy to be here.
Great, and we will be sharing this out on our YouTube channel. We'll send out a link and put it on our website as well so that people can have access to this. So if you have colleagues who would like to watch this at home another time when it works better for them, that should be available.
Thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.